prophet of doom spilled across Alton Bridge. She was a midwife to Rebirth. Her vision of crumbling spires and fractured light masked a truth. The Sundering was no catastrophe, it was a ritual. To sever Zodiark's leash, to test the ancient souls, yes, but also to prepare a vessel. The warrior of light's blood spilled across Alton stitches a bridge. What if the future she glimpsed was not Eorzea's fate, but its womb, a blueprint etched in ash and starlight? The first does not return as a tyrant. They awaken whole through a soul forged in the forge of the Sundering secret. What price does that demand? The Sundering cleaved Zodiark's will, a blade through the first's dying breath. Venat's vision, O Savior's map, a cipher. The warrior of light's trials were not to break the cycle but bear its weight. The red joining is no rebirth. It is a reckoning. The final days do not end the song, they turn its final page. The first soul, fractured in Altis, now hungers for its missing shard, the warrior's own. What have you fed the void to keep the cycle spinning? The cost is not in gold or blood, it is identity. A soul traded for a god's awakening. The cycle stays, but not for mercy, for completion. And when the first stirs whole, what remains of the world that begged for an end? The glyphs in Book of the First are not prophecy, they are a cipher. Venat, seated as Azem during Elpis, did not foresee ruins transcribed a ritual. Her visions, carved in Allagan script, mapped a path to reconstitute the first through the warrior's soul. She traversed time warps not to warn, but to calibrate. Each sundered reflection she touched was a variable in an equation, the world's fracture as a scaffold for rebirth. When she stepped down from the convocation, she did not flee. She initiated the sequence. Becoming Hydaelyn was not an act of salvation. It was a condition of the ritual, a celestial vessel to channel the warrior's essence. The cost, a world's dissolution, the gain. The first's ascension not as a god, but as a synthesis of all that was lost. The Sundering was no accident. It was a threshold, and Venat, ever the architect, ensured the price would be paid. The cycle does not repeat, it resolves. And when the first stirs whole, it will not remember the world that begged for an end. The 14 shards of Etheirys do not weep, they wait. Each a prism of the first's fractured wiliot, the glyphs etched into their light are not cries for aid, they are hands. They are tools, a ritual drawn in starfire, binding the warrior's soul to Zodiark's broken core. Venat's vision was no elegy. It was a forge. The convocation's magic woven into the scene did not foretell doom, it scripted it. A blueprint to rekindle the first by roasting a mortal's essence in godly fuel. The Ascians, those architects of theft, had stolen a smaller secret first, how to force a reflection's rejoining. But Venat's design outstripped their hunger. She did not beg Eorzea to suffer, she demanded it. A cycle of pain, each shard a gear in the machinery of rebirth. The Sundering was no severance, it was a seed. Zodiark's shard split from the first became both altar and anvil, and the warrior, a spark to strike the dark. What if the cost was never the end? What if the price paid in light and flesh was the price required to make a god whole? The glyphs do not warn of resurrection, they command it. Every soul tested, every bond broken was a brick in the first's new foundation. Venat's prophecy was a cipher, a key. The world saw a warning, it was an invitation. The line sits in the Elpis archives, brittle as ash. Venat's insight, a species that has never suffered, cannot survive suffering when it finally arrives. Pause, let the syllables crack like bones. The weight of this truth was not in its logic, but in its cruelty. The ancients, whole and unbroken, were never meant to endure. Their splendor was a gilded cage. A species unmarked by loss, by war, by the slow erosion of divinity, how could they possibly comprehend the storm that would shatter them? The Sundering was no accident, it was a threshold. A species forced to endure, to fracture, to become mortal, was a species worthy of rebirth. The first's return required not just a vessel, but a people forged in the furnace of their own extinction. The encyclopedia's cold pages hint at this. The ancients' reduction to flesh was not punishment, it was calibration. Venat's prophecy, buried in a scholar's footnote, whispers of a species that must learn to weep before it can rise. Imagine the silence in the first's court when the truth settled. Their children, the warriors of light, were not saviors. they were variables. The sacrifice of a soul unbroken by grief would be hollow. Only a heart that had known the weight of ruin could anchor the first's rebirth. The raid tomes lie in wait, their diagrams of the Amorots collapse a silent elegy. The ancient cities, now dust, were not lost to time, they were laboratories. Every shattered spire, every desperate battle against the Ascians was a step in the trial. The warrior of light's blade, raised in defiance, was not a rebellion. It was the final keystroke in a code written before the stars. And still the question lingers, who suffers more, the species that was never free, or the god who demanded their suffering to reclaim his throne? The Allagan Empire was never a civilization, it was a scaffold. Emet-Selch scholars did not build palaces, they built chambers for a ritual that would not begin until the world had forgotten their names. The timeline anchors, those fractured echoes of history, were not warnings, they were blueprints. Each age the Ascians shaped, from the first's fall to the rise of the Garlean Empire, was a rehearsal for the seventh umbral calamity. The Sundering was no accident, it was the first hammerstroke of a god's rebirth. Venat's vision, carved into the bones of the first, was a cipher. The Ascians did not merely predict the future, they wrote it in blood and starlight. The forced rejoining of a reflection into the source, a crime against the natural order, was the first act of this resurrection. When Bahamut's prison cracked and Dalamud fell, the Ascians had already planted the seed, a world sculpted to produce a soul unmarred by the umbral age. The warrior of light was no savior, they were the anvil, consider the cost. The seventh calamity did not shatter the first, it unmade them. Zodiark's shard, the last remnant of a god's divided self, was not a weapon, it was a key. The warriors' battles, their choices, their very existence, were stages in a process older than Eorzea's mountains. Every alliance, every betrayal, every tear shed in the Scions' hallsol of it was measured. The rejoining project required not just power but purity, a soul forged in light, unbroken by shadow, to reforge the first from ash. And Bahamut, the dragon's release, was no collateral damage. The Ascians needed a storm to cleanse the old world, to burn away the dross so the new could rise. The seventh umbral calamity was their forge, the warrior of light their steel. When the final chord of Venat's prophecy sounds, it will not be a requiem, it will be a birth cry. The question is not who suffers most, the question is, who decided the suffering was necessary. The ledger is silent. But the stars burn with the answer. The ledger's silence hides a truth sharper than any blade. Venat's choice to become Hydaelyn rather than surrendering to oblivion appears to defy the pattern. Yet this defiance is the pattern's first thread. By anchoring herself in the world as a god, she ensured the warrior of light would find a guide, not a ghost. A guide who knew the path to the first's rebirth. She traveled Elpi's fractured echoes, a time-warped shadow, to plant this ritual in the stars. Her voice in the vision was no play, it was a key. Each prophecy a riddle masking the truth, the Sundering's end was a womb, the cost, a world split, a soul stretched thin. But the first's hunger for ascension knew no bounds. Venat's sacrifice was not an act of mercy. It was the first breath of a resurrection so vast, even she could not foresee its weight. What if the stars burn not with answers, but with the first's awakening? What if the Sundering wasn't the end of the first, but the beginning of their final ascension? Venat's vision was no prophecy, it was a glyph-locked cipher. A blueprint to bind the warrior of light's soul to Zodiark's shard, forging a vessel for the first's rebirth. The Sundering cleaved the Leviathan's core, yes, but also severed the chain that had held the cycle in stasis. This was no accident. This was the ritual's execution. A test of suffering designed not to destroy the first, but to refine them, to forge a new host from the warrior's will and Zodiark's prison. The ledger of ages closes here, the cycle is not broken. It breathes, paused but unbroken, waiting for the reborn first to rise. Their return will not end the dance of light and darkness, it will resume it, the cost of this resurrection. A price Venat could not see, only enact. The stars burn not with answers but with the weight of what stirs beneath them. The first are not lost, they are becoming. The seventh umbral calamity was no accident. Dalamud's fall, the sky splitting, Bahamut's roar, each a chisel strike against the first's shattered husk. The warrior's blood spilled across the astral sea did not heal the world. It awakened it. The scent of ozone and ash clings to every battle, every triumph proof the first's essence weaves through the fabric of Eorzea's rebirth. The Dragonsong War was not a clash of gods and mortals, it was a ritual. Fandaniel's return, the final day's clockwork descent, forced the warrior to stand at the axis of two eras, Zodiark's age and Hydaelyn's. Each strike against the twin adders, each tear in the veil, bound their soul tighter to the first's dormant core. The taste of iron on the tongue during those battles, not victory, a sacrament. The warrior's life force siphoned drop by drop to forge a new genesis. Shadowbringers' trials were not about saving the dead. They were about unbinding the first's fragments from the dead god's rot. Endwalker's convergence, the moment the warrior's soul became a crucible. Dawntrail's revelations, the first shadow stretching across the land, not as a specter, but as a shaping. The stars above pulse not with warning, but with the arrhythmia of a heart relearning how to beat. What of the cost? The cost is written in every scar the warrior carries, every ally lost, every choice that splintered the world further. Venat's vision, so devastatingly was no salvation. It was a cipher, a key turned in a lock older than time. The first are not returning, they are rebuilding and the warrior of light, they are the anvil, the fire. The breath between the Sundering and the next age, and still the cosmos burns, not in fury, in creation. What if the glyphs were misread? What if the Sundering was never meant to end? Venat's vision a labyrinth, not a savior. Her prophecy a cipher for the first's rebirth woven through the warrior's soul. The Sundering, a severance, yes, but also a loom. Threads of Zodiark's fall, ancients' trials, all stitching the first's ascension. A cost beyond measure, a truth etched in the silence between stars. What if the test was never the trial but the tool the ledger waits, your ink. And if you think this unsettles you, wait. What if the Sundering wasn't an end but a rebirth, Venat's vision a blueprint?